Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Jack Kirby. They created men into gods and gods into men. Kirby's Pietà, Michelangelo's Pietà. The greatest fine artist in history, the greatest comic book artist in history, whose creations have taken over television and film with the Avengers, with the new gods yet to come from Warner Brothers, the Eternals from Disney. That would be the works of Jack Kirby, born Yakov Kurtzberg and raised in the Lower East Side, and gave us a universe of comic characters and concepts that have been unequaled and unparalleled in the history of comics. Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only King of Comics, Jack Kirby. And my name is Arlen Schumer, and welcome. This is the fourth in my monthly series of great comic book artists of the Silver Age. I've been doing them once a month, the last Wednesday of every month, and I started with Infantino in January, Kurt Swan in February, and then Jack Kirby the end of March, but I couldn't do Kirby in just one installment, so welcome to part two. I did a book on comic book art in the 1960s, the Silver Age, as opposed to the 1940s, the Golden Age. And the book really centers on the work of 8 of what I consider our great Renaissance masters of the human figure. In the same way we look back on the great Renaissance masters, so too do I believe 500 years from now, people will be looking back on these giants who walked the earth, our masters of comic book art. Each artist gets a double-page spread introduction in which I ghost a piece of their autobiographical art behind my text introduction. And that would be Jack Kirby's self-portrait, done in 1970, the same year that he leaves behind all of those creations you see on this autobiographical illustration. All of the characters of Marvel Comics. There wouldn't have been a Make Mine Marvel phrase in the 60s if it wasn't for Kirby's creations. The thought that he would leave Marvel Comics in 1970 and go to the rival DC Comics was just a seismic shock in the comic community, because the collaboration of Jack Kirby with Stan Lee, who is the editor and the writer of the dialogue and narration to Kirby's stories and character creations, which is what I believe the forensic comic book evidence tells us. The breakup of their collaboration was as unthinkable in 1970 as the news that the Beatles were breaking up. 1970, the same year Simon and Garfunkel broke up. I mean, in many ways, the Simon and Garfunkel creative relationship is closer to Lee and Kirby's, because in the same way Simon and Garfunkel's music was written by Paul Simon, it was Art Garfunkel who gave his lyrics the voice that we remember, especially from that epic Bridge Over Troubled Water. In the same way, Stan Lee, by writing the dialogue and narration and giving those Marvel comics their editorial voice, that's 50% of the comic book reading experience. We were hearing Stan Lee as we were reading the stories and character creations of Jack Kirby, of Steve Ditko, of the Marvel Comics artists. that worked with Stan Lee. Now, that is, of course, a side subject for a whole nother webinar. But suffice to say, it was their so-called collaboration that is part and parcel of what eventually would tear them apart and make Kirby go to rival DC. One clue is to look at what happened with Kirby's Silver Surfer, shown here at the beginning of 1968, one of Kirby's great Silver Surfer covers with his character, the Watcher, in the background. But later in 68, when it's announced that the Silver Surfer would get his own title, a 25-cent annual with extra-length stories, but it wouldn't be by Jack Kirby, that was the art of the great John Buscema. Now, John Buscema went on to do the Silver Surfer with Stan Lee for the next 2 years and produced some of his greatest superhero work of all time with his own vision of the Silver Surfer, a more live, flexible surfer. Kirby went on during those last couple of years at Marvel, doing things like giving his Inhumans their own backup series. And then, very quirkily, in September of 1970, the summer Kirby leaves Marvel, the last issue of the Silver Surfer with a Herb Trimpe cover. Herb Trimpe was Marvel's Hulk artist. And what was peculiar about this issue was that Kirby did the story, even though, of course, look at the credits in the bottom right. Script by Stan Lee. Kirby only penciled it, right? Well, notice how it begins with a title, To Smash the Inhumans. Now, the Inhumans are Kirby's own creation, as is the Silver Surfer and everything else you're looking at. Herb Trimpe inks Jack Kirby in this issue, and it's actually one of Kirby's most beautiful ink jobs. They were actually a great team. This issue features, Kirby at his best, and Trimpe totally understands Kirby's line. But it's when you get to the very final page of this story that you get this full-page image, as we've never seen the Silver Surfer before. And when you actually read this dialogue, that might be Stan Lee's dialogue, but it's Kirby's story, remember. No longer will I resist their earthly madness. No longer mine a lonely voice, pleading peace in a world of strife. From this time forth, the Silver Surfer will battle them on their own savage terms. Let mankind beware. From this time forth, the Surfer will be the deadliest one of all. And if this image doesn't express Jack Kirby's feeling that his creations, like the Silver Surfer, were being taken away from him and he had no control over them, is what made him go to DC Comics in 1970. That's Kirby shown with DC publisher and great artist Carmine Infantino, the first comic book artist to attain publisher status in a comic book company. And by the way, that's Mark Evanier in the background. Long time. He worked with Kirby on the DC books in 1970 to 72 or 3, and is one of Kirby's biographers, the major domo of Kirby fandom, Mark Evanier, shown there, I think, at age 18, maybe. So, comic book fandom was not that big in those days. It was a large cult. There were a handful of fanzines. People communicated by mail. Comic conventions had just been starting in the late 60s. But this was the top half of DC's house ad in their late 1970 or summer 1970 comic books. The word from on high is the great one is coming. Look sharp, look up, look out. Behind you, above you, all around you. It's the Boom Tube and all its awesome wonders coming to National 70. People, places, things. So powerful in concept, it's almost terrifying. Now, I was one of, I think, a lot of fans that had no effing clue that this had anything to do with Jack Kirby. This is, without a doubt, the worst. Let me try to do my best Simpsons comic book guy impression. Worst house ed ever. Anyway, yeah, I had no idea. So then so late summer 1970, this half-page house ad appears. Kirby's coming, Kirby's coming, Kirby's coming? No, he's here with his first blockbuster. But it's Jimmy Olsen? The issue before was typical of what Jimmy Olsen had been doing since 1954. You know, cockamamie comic book plots of Superman turning on him and Jimmy turning on Superman. And I mean, all the, but meanwhile, it was one of DC's biggest selling titles, whatever. But maybe at the time in 1970, when Kirby came to DC, one of the things they asked him to do was do one of their own comics in addition to his own that they were giving him. And he didn't want to take work away from any steady titles, artists, or writers, because the deal was he would write and draw and edit his own work. And that was Kirby's Depression era mentality. So he said, what is one of your lowest selling titles? And I think at the time of the Superman family titles, it was Jimmy Olsen. And it was through Jimmy Olsen that Kirby would actually make his debut at the end of summer 1970. But right away, if you were an aficionado of Kirby's work, you took one look at this cover and I was like, what is that weird Superman art? It's like a Kirby body. We recognized the inks of Vince Colletta, but the face wasn't really Kirby. That looked like one of the DC house artists, Al Plastino. Of course, years later, this pencil drawing would surface of Kirby's rejected cover, whether it's assuming rejected by Carmine Infantino, but I'm not sure if anybody knows for sure. But you can see right from the start, while it was the biggest, it was the comic book equivalent of the Beatles breaking up and, forming a new supergroup, Kirby at DC, doing Superman and Jimmy Olsen and other titles to come. And yet, right from the beginning, DC is already screwing with Kirby's work and not letting Kirby's vision, this magnum opus, as you'll see, come to true unfettered fruition. Because right from the beginning, we got compromised images like this. But okay, let's give Jimmy Olsen a try. Of course, right from the start, Kirby's blowing our mind with these double-page spread concepts, things we hadn't ever seen before in comics, even in his own comics. But now, again, we're looking at that Superman and, it doesn't look like Kirby. He continues his collages. At the time, they probably didn't look as good as what you're seeing on your screen, thanks to Photoshop, because the printing back then. But, Kirby was blowing our minds in the last half of the 60s over at Marvel with these photo collages. So we were really, overjoyed that he was doing them at DC as well. And yet again, look at that Superman face. The head's wrong. I can't help it. I was raised on Superman. I'm going to go to that. I mean, look at this compromised image. On the one hand, Kirby's collaging and his introduction of concepts. I mean, read that dialogue. In these charts, Jimmy, lies the essence of the project. The secret of light, what long hidden in the DNA molecule, has been extracted, is now being used for mankind's benefit. I mean, this is like, are you kidding me? And yet, look at that Superman head. That is not Jack Kirby's artwork. And as cool as the rest of the image is, and it was blowing our young minds as we were seeing this, I'm sorry, but I kept being pulled out of this incredible, every page a new concept. There's the boom tube, Kirby's cute pun on boob tube, of course, what television was known for. Well, we weren't getting the stuff on television, folks, and stuff that sounds familiar, like, Rick and Morty's dimensional portals. Well, there's Kirby, doing it in 1970. And yet, that's like a Murphy Anderson Superman head. So what was going on? And again, we only found stuff like this out years later, when in magazines like the Jack Kirby Collector, they would publish, I'm talking about 25 years later, we see Kirby's incredible pencils of Clark Kent. Look at that Clark Kent in the second panel, and Jimmy Olsen. And yet, this is what would end up getting produced by the DC production department. They get the artist, Murphy Anderson. Nothing against Murphy. I love Murphy Anderson. But I hate what he had to do here. Talk about being a company man. Are you kidding me? Look at these incredible pencils. Look at that Kirby vision of Superman. And yet, this is what we got instead. Murphy Anderson Superman heads, even on Jimmy Olsen. To me, this is the proportional equivalent of what they did to Michelangelo's Last Judgment on the wall of the Sistine Chapel, when they painted tutus over everybody's naked parts after he died. Kirby had to live to see his magnum opus being forever marred, disfigured, desecrated by that tiny little, Murphy Anderson or Al Plastino Superman head in the upper right corner that distracts me from the incredible double page spread that you're looking at of what only looks like a giant Hulk at DC Comics fighting. Now, is that the Guardians? The Guardians. Yeah, back in the 40s. There they were, drawn by Jack Kirby in his early 40s style. And here he was drawing himself in the back of Jimmy Olsen. Look at what he says here. Kirby's the name and comics is my game. I can tell you, pals, I enjoy every minute of it. Sure, it's great going around the big creative bend and bringing in a sensational newie. But the biggies of the golden age of comics remain a giant experience in themselves. Try a bag of genuine golden age grabbers. There's one of mine in this mag. Could be a classic from the Boy Commandos, Sandman, Manhunter, or the original Newsboy Legion. Everything is as it was. And yet at the same time, here's Kirby with a character drawing on his drawing board circa 1969 when he's about to leave Marvel Comics and bring to DC Comics character ideas that he had gestating for years, but that he didn't want to give to Marvel Comics after seeing how, post circa 1965 or so, how his creations were not owned by him, were taken away from him, and never to have control of them ever again. Instead, he brought them to DC Comics, where they let him write and edit what had never before been done, a series of 3 comics, including Jimmy Olsen. That would be 4. It was called The Fourth World. 4 interlocking, ongoing comic books telling one big story through 4 perspectives. Sounds almost commonplace today. It's like Game of Thrones. But first we got, or at least the first one I remember seeing, was this incredible cover for the New Gods. And just the mix of the full color Orion, I already gave away. Oh yeah, Orion fights for it. There it is. With the what's called a mezzotint background. We didn't know the word mezzotint then, but that's what that is. Supposedly, the great Neil Adams is the one that suggested the mezzotint background to the DC production heads when they were putting this cover together, because I think they used that exact Kirby character drawing that he had done years earlier for the cover of issue 1. So here's what we get when we get Kirby's first work of this new series of interlocking titles that followed actually Jimmy Olsen by a couple of months. There came a time when the old gods died, the brave died with the cunning, the noble perished, locked in battle with unleashed evil. It was the last day for them. An ancient era was passing in fiery holocaust. Now, this is about 4 or 5 years earlier. I think it's printed in early 66. That means Kirby's doing it in late 65. The Tales of Asgard backup stories in Thor of the Norse legends as translated by Kirby, of course, with dialogue and narration by Stan Lee. But Kirby tackled the end of the gods, Ragnarok, the Norse equivalent of Armageddon. I mean, one of his greatest Thor covers a couple of years later has Ragnarok as its theme. But these were the old gods that died in Ragnarok. Kirby was giving us new gods for the 1970s. So after we get past this, to many of us, familiar splash page, we get this sequence of events. The top panel. The final moment came with a fatal release of indescribable power, which tore the home of the old gods asunder, split it in great halves, and filled the universe with a blinding death flash of its destruction. Really great abstract Kirby art. In the end, there were 2 giant molten bodies, spinning slow and barren, clean of all that had gone before, adrift in the fading sounds of cosmic thunder. Silence closed upon what had happened, a long, deep silence, wrapped in massive darkness. It was this way for an age. Then there was new light across the vast distances where the mysteries deepen and hide and wait with answers not yet known. A call has been heard, a name summoned for the ultimate mission, to thwart the ultimate destruction. Thus he comes, the protector, wielder of the astral force, Orion of the new gods, an epic for our time. I have heard the word, it is battle. Orion fights for Earth. Written, drawn, and edited by Jack Kirby. I mean, folks, I'm trying to read this like everybody who loves, this period of Kirby's work talks about it being operatic. Kirby was trying to do comic book opera. No more glorious sight has ever greeted any eyes than that of New Genesis, home of the new gods, a golden island of gleaming spires that orbits a sunlit, unspoiled world of green forests, white mountains, and bright waters, the true place of peace. It sings a haunting song, even to the warrior heart. Make haste, Orion. Now, once again, we comic book fans that were dying to see what Kirby was going to do at DC, this kind of looked familiar. Of course, we were used to Thor's Asgard floating by the rainbow bridge of Asgard. But this was Kirby's new take, the new Genesis. And this was how he pictured it in 1970. One of his great full-page images in that first issue of New Gods is just classic Kirby, larger than life. I mean, so much of what Kirby is about, I said gods as men and men as gods, is in an image like this. So we're introduced to the next new god. You must stay this time, Orion. Forget the sound of battle. Learn to laugh again. I fear that my recall is not a laughing matter, Light Ray. Nonsense! To laugh is to feel the beat of life. Live, Orion, live! This is Light Ray, lighthearted and brimming with personal qualities. He is the friendliest of the new gods. But when battle comes, he is a formidable foe in the clash between New Genesis and dread apocalypse. Light Ray turns the power of light into a weapon of astounding magnitude. Follow his exploits, as goes Orion, so goes Light Ray, into domains where even gods are subject to the whims of grim destiny. Now, look at this beautiful pencil page by Kirby. All that remains is this many generations down Xerox of the pencils. That's not the actual pencil page, of course, but thanks to probably the folks at the Jack Kirby Collector magazine, we can see how this was transformed by the inks of Mike Royer, who joins Kirby about a year into the run, and many people feel he is Kirby's definitive inker, and so much of the art you're going to see is inked by Royer, but the first year was inked by his old mainstay, Vince Colletta, who was the Marvel inker and somehow came over to DC at that time to ink Kirby's Fourth World debuts. And here we have the introduction of the next major new god, and that would be Metron, you icy mask. You know, if my brother Steve, my older brother Steve, who was a major Kirby fan, when we grew up in the 60s, I was the DC fan. We used to argue who was greater, Neil Adams or Jack Kirby. But I got to tell you, my brother was like many fans that really didn't like Kirby's dialoguing, didn't like his writing. And for some reason, Metron, you icy mask, will forever stick in my brother's craw as the thing that turned him off to the Fourth World. But more of that later. Let's talk about Metron in this funky chair. Now, back in the 60s over at Marvel, in his Captain America stories, he introduced MODOK. And you can see he's this troll-like mutant dwarf, whatever the hell he is. But he's on an obvious Kirby contraption, and that's contraption spelled with a K, of course. But in his sort of, levitating flying chair. Now, so many of Kirby's themes, like any great artist, you can trace back. Kirby was doing stories about flying chairs in the 1950s. I think this was with Joe Simon, maybe, his partner, writer and inker and whatever, but there's Donegan's Daffy chair. So all Kirby's doing is, his mature style, doing what he does best, which is just incredible mixtures of, you get so much of Kirby's artistic signatures in this one image. But check out this pencil of one of Kirby's collage pages. So he knows that he's going to put a photo collage in the back of this art, but you can see in his own hand lettering the feeling of what he was writing, and there's where the operatic identity comes in. But here's how it was transformed as one of his great collages. I've leaped the stars toward the final barrier. Alyssa Celestial would begin to show fear in this area, but not Metron. Now, the Supergirl series, or was this the Flash? I forget. One of the CW series had, the villain in a very Metron-like chair. But speaking of villains, here's where we're introduced to the big kahuna. Regaining his equilibrium, Orion descends. Before him looms a huge, awesome figure, hewn of rugged stone. Hail, Darkseid, ruler of apocalypse. Now, obviously, Kirby intended Darkseid, and some people said Darkseid. I think my brother and I called him Dark Seed, and really either pronunciation works, like Submariner and Submariner. They're both valid. Dynamo or Dynamo, take your pick. But obviously he intended him to be the Doctor Doom at DC Comics. Doctor Doom being the great Marvel Comics Fantastic Four villain. And here's our introduction to Oh Deadly Dark Side. And I mean, this was a character, he meant business. The battle begins. Now, if you've seen the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League, this is how Darkseid was presented, as some combination of human actor, maybe, with total computer-generated animation and whatever they do these days through the mastery of special effects. But, judge for yourself whether they truly captured what Kirby intended with Darkseid. Now, this particular image, and boy, we could spend half the webinar on some of these ancillary characters in the background, like Glorious Godfrey. And if his orange hair seems familiar, I won't go there, but you know who I'm referring to. But notice how this image in the United Kingdom ended up on a Pink Floyd bootleg album cover in the early 70s. Here's what it looks like as a flat piece of art. Now, Kirby stated in interviews, I think years later, that he was intending for Darkseid to really be whom he felt was the villain of the age, and that would be Richard Nixon. And those of us who lived through Nixon knows he was really the beginning of the end of the Republican Party, the shambles that it's in today. But when you think of Nixon, that's who Kirby said he intended Darkseid to be. Another incredibly monumental, beautiful pencil drawing that really encapsulates so much of Kirby's stylization of reality. And that's pretty much true in any beautifully preserved pencil we have of Kirby's work, with one of Darkseid's great close-ups using his finder beams, as he calls them. And notice again Michael Royer's faithful inks to the pencil, and then how much color brings to the work. Now, see, poorly printed. You can actually see the other page behind. That's how badly printed Kirby's comics, his magnum opus, had to suffer through. Now, who is this interesting character? We'll get to the other guy later. The henchman. Yeah, Desaad. Among them is hidden the mind which can solve the anti-life equation. With the answer to that, Desaad. Again, Kirby on all his not misspellings, but that's what he got learning over in Marvel Comics, understand Lee's, with all those monster titles, Fin Fang Foom and words like that. But there is Desaad, and yeah, if he looks familiar, yeah, I'd say so. I think George Lucas knew what he was doing. Here's what Desaad looked like in the Snyder cut of Justice League, and their interpretation of him in the background. But yes, of course, Lucas, he was either working or whatever in a comic book store in San Francisco in the early 70s. Absolutely, Darkseid is an inspiration for this guy years later. There wouldn't be parody images like this of this classic Fantastic Four cover by Kirby, introducing the Silver Surfer. So yes, so much of the Star Wars mythos, mythology, and character design, in a way, you can find in Kirby's Fourth World. Because the major revelation, of course, is that Darkseid is the father of our hero, Orion of the New Gods. And in the same way as this internet meme will show you, that Darkseid in 1971 offers to Orion, his son, "Stay, warrior, let me complete the destruction of scot-free, so you may live with the majesty that is the power of Darkseid. Don't make me destroy you. Join me and I will complete your training. If you only knew the power of the Darkseid. Jack Kirby, you are my father." Yeah, when Orion took off that helmet, he was just a good-looking, Greek Adonis type that Kirby loved to draw. But that wasn't Orion's true face. This was. You're a mad, tormented animal, Orion. This is the son of Darkseid. If it were not for the mother box. What is the mother box? This is the mother box, a handheld device. Ping, 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 ping. Enables Orion to have that Mick Jagger-like, I don't know, that's what it looks like to me a little bit. Like if Mick Jagger were drawn by Kirby. But yes, this is Kirby in 1970, giving us that. Decades later, Kirby the Visionary. This is a fine mother box, but it's Himmon's model, powered by the Source. A type like this cretin could never contact the Source. Use the Source, Luke. I mean, the Force, Luke. Yeah, sound familiar? Well, the Yoda that Kirby gave us was this guy, High Father, he was called. Now, I always thought a couple years later, in 1973, when we got this incredible cinematic image, yeah, that's a giant stone head that could also fly. It happens to be resting now on the ground. But that would be Sean Connery in 1973 with one of the trippiest science fiction films. You got to see it just for the sight of Connery walking around in a red bathing suit with the high leather, whatever those things are called. But yeah, so High Father, silence, the wonder staff which called you is in turn summoned by the Source. The wall awaits the written word. Metron in the background. What wouldn't I give to possess the knowledge of the Source? This wall is our link with the Source. It lived even as the old gods died. That is so, says Orion. It is eternal. It is the life equation. And its power is a part of your wonder staff. Behold, High Father is linked with the Source. See, the hand appears and reveals the word. Okay, and this is what we get. Across the wall, a hand of flame brings Isaiah, notice how Kirby spells it, the unifriend. Well, that's a whole nother concept. Yeah, the hand that writes the word on the wall. Now, this is what the biblical patriarch that Kirby is pulls out of the Old Testament from the book of Daniel, in which I think it's the son of Nebuchadnezzar who had, destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. exile the Jews to Babylon. I think this is his son who was given a warning to, bow down to God. And it was written on the wall in his palace by a mysterious ghostly hand. And the words were basically saying, if you don't repent of your selfishness and, not acting in accordance with God's laws, you will die. And of course, I think the next night or the next day, he had died in his sleep. So here we get Kirby's interpretation of that. The moving hand appears. The source gives us the irrevocable counsel, but it does not decide. The right of choice is ours. That is the life equation. The anti-life equation was undiscovered until these days. It means the outside control of all living thought. I mean, folks, this is why, reading Kirby's, we were being bombarded. Every sentence was like another concept. Apocalypse. Now, what was apocalypse? This is apocalypse. If the other side of good is evil, then surely apocalypse is the other side. Even its giant energy pits feed on the world itself to gain its power and light. Of course, in the Star Wars universe, does this look familiar? Yes. The death, come on. Are you kidding me? And then let's look at some of the villains of apocalypse, like Steppenwolf, cut down the enemy, give no quarter. Now, somehow, Steppenwolf got translated in the first Zack Snyder / Joss Whedon Justice League film of a couple of years ago and ended up looking like that somehow. And then just recently in the Zack Snyder Justice League, we get this crazy looking guy. I don't know what to make of this. It was just too much, man. But Kirby, again, was unleashing character upon character in the New Gods, that each one, look at the psychedelia of this one. I don't think that's how it was originally colored, but I think that's the art I found on the internet. But check out this character, the Bug, another one of Kirby's, like Aztec, some kind of, Mayan, Incan imagery, even Native American in the head mask. But again, Kirby's concepts 50 years later are still being used by modern comics creators like the great Michael Allred, who a couple of years ago got to do a whole issue or maybe more on Kirby's Bug character because he liked him so much. One of the artists of the New Gods was introduced in issue 3. And yes, Death is the Black Racer. Are we looking at what I think we're looking at? First of all, we got the cool photo of the Manhattan skyline and the very graphic sky. Again, these are new comics with, kind of a new look for the 70s, different from the 60s. But yeah, that's a black guy looking like a knight of shining armor on skis flying through the air. What the? Now, of course, this was Kirby he couldn't do the Silver Surfer. So instead, we got the Black Racer. In great images like this, though, look at the kind of X composition in this one. Foolish one, was it not told to you in New Genesis of the Black Racer's superb agility? You cannot escape me. All through this saga that Kirby was unleashing on us, every page that we turned gave us something that literally brought to life the adage of a picture being worth 1,000 words. All we know about this is that in the word and thought balloon down below left, the Promethean galaxy, the place of the giants, alive, chained to the fragments of the devices they use in their attempts to smash the final barrier. Anyway, you can see that the double page spread, I mean, look at that giant arm, the left arm of this guy, Promethean-like in Kirby's visual language. And just the stylization of anatomy. Kirby's like a mixture of like Picasso's cubism with Michelangelo's sculptural monolithic state. Yeah, that's the best way I think I can describe an image like this. But look at how it's been used. This was, I guess, maybe an EP or a record album. Doesn't matter. The fact that it's being done is part of the, Requiem for Jack Kirby. But look at Kirby himself back in the 50s in his, earlier style, his immature style, as I call it. But nevertheless, people love it. I only like Kirby when his style matures at Marvel in the mid-60s, but that's me. But you can see that Kirby is constantly, like any great artist who has a 6-decade career, like Kirby did, recycles and reuses and reinvents concepts. And throughout the Fourth World series, double page spread upon double page spread of images that felt like they were plugged into the electrical outlet. I hope somehow on your screens, the intensity of these images, and we're back to that operatic quality. This was Kirby on the two-dimensional printed page, trying to give us, in a sense, what we would get decades later with these Lord of the Rings epics and the cinematic universe we have today. Kirby is giving us that in the early 70s with his Fourth World series. I mean, these were one-page concepts he would then dismiss and never return to them. This guy with the incredible, exoskeleton amplified arm. I mean, you can feel the power of that thrust, and just again the brutalism of Kirby's art. You're going to see me use that word when you talk about brutalist architecture. Well, there's a brutalism to Kirby's work that is part of its massive energy. It's why you can feel that beam emanating from this Meko character. I mean, strike, overlord, obey. Indeed. I think the great DC artist Gil Kane, who at that time was jockeying back and forth between DC and Marvel, I think years later, he remembers seeing this image of this beast, the glory boat or whatever the hell it was called. You can almost feel that thing, that giant Kirby bubblegum pink Moby Dick meets Godzilla, whatever you want to describe that as. But nothing quite top one of the greatest images in not only Kirby's oeuvre, but in comic book history, is really this image, which speaks volumes about everything about Jack Kirby that you want to discuss. There it is in pencil form before Mike Royer so beautifully inked it. But this image has it all, baby. It's got everything about the operatic quality. If we must die, let New Genesis live. If we go to the source, you demons go with us. 3 exclamation points. The Kirby tech. the Kirby crackle, the force lines, the speed lines, the motion lines. The great Alex Ross, decades later, would fully paint his version of that image as homage. Anyway, even though I think Forever People came out a couple weeks earlier than New Gods, I remember seeing it after. So I chose to put it after. I also think in terms of impact, Forever People felt like the least of the Fourth World titles for some reason, maybe because it lacked a center focus. Yes, it was a group title, obviously. There's the double page spread that kicks it off. Again, inked by Vince Colletta. If you didn't like Vince Colletta at Marvel, this is also what bummed my brother and I out. We didn't like Vince Colletta at Marvel, and we certainly were not happy to see him at DC. And then look at that picture of Superman they slapped down, pasting up clip art onto a master's magnum opus. So what were the Forever People about? Obviously, this group of, young new gods, they look like. Well, Kirby was living in California since 1969, and he had a swimming pool, and down below, you can see that he lived above a valley there, but down below there were living quarters, I don't know, houses, whatever were down there. And there were a bunch of, I guess, what would be called hippies that were, having a blast and living life and doing drugs and who knows what else. Look, there's Time magazine's report about the hippies. But Kirby was exposed to them, and he didn't, have an adverse reaction. In fact, he welcomed them, and he kind of dug where they were coming from, man. And he put that hippie counterculture spirit into the Forever People with these characters. And you talk about inclusion, yes, there's a woman and she's equal to the rest. She's not just the invisible girl like in the Fantastic Four, but is that an African American new god? Yes. But yes, he had to be known as Viking the Black, I guess, because they're whatever. Let's not go there because that's a whole nother story. But Kirby created the Black Panther, so we'll cut him some slack. At least he tried to get, an African American into the group. And like all of Kirby's work from this point on, he just always had fun with double page spreads, which is something, if you were here for part one, was a graphic tool of Kirby's to always make the most of in terms of maximum action and movement. I never really got into the Forever People. They, like I said, for some reason, it didn't attract me. But, some of the art that he turned out as pinups and posters for the Forever People are some of Kirby's best early 70s works, like this incredible point of view of the group with classic Kirby architecture. And then there was the third of the Fourth World books, or if you count again, the Jimmy Olsen, the fourth of the Fourth World books to be introduced in early 1971. Mr. Miracle. What the is Mr. Miracle? He cheats death. He defies man. No trap can hold him. Mr. Miracle, super escape artist. My enemies think that escape from this is impossible, but they're in for a rude shock. Goodbye, Mr. Miracle. You lost your wager and your life. Kirby's here, the making of a legend. Okay, so what was Mr. Miracle? There is the original Mr. Miracle drawing that I think Kirby had his artist friend at Marvel, Don Heck, ink. But you can see, in the close-up. I think this must have been done in 67 maybe. But you can see the color scheme Kirby chose. I mean, I can only describe as puke green and piss yellow. And thank God that starting with issue 1, he began to make the change towards brighter primary colors. But in the first issue, we get purple, yellow, and green. Kind of an odd combination. But let's see. What was Mr. Miracle about? Well, Kirby was buddies with the young tyro Jim Steranko, 20 years his junior, who had burst upon the scene in the mid to late 60s. And he really claimed to fame with his version of Kirby's concept, Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. This is from the summer of 1968, the height of the early counterculture and pop art at its zenith and psychedelia. And Steranko was at the peak of it. He even got to do his favorite character, which was his homage to Kirby's Captain America. But he had a real Renaissance man background. He was a rock and roll singer. He worked in advertising, and he was also an escape artist. Yeah, I mean, in his teenage years, there's Steranko looking like a Reading, Pennsylvania Houdini, which is what he was. And somehow, Kirby takes that concept and turns it into Mr. Miracle and brings it into the fourth world. And notice how now we get rid of the purple, and now we get the red, yellow, and green colors that Mr. Miracle would be known for. And again, in all of these comics, you get these great double-page spreads, interesting vantage point here. Not something you see every day in any comic book, but look at also the stylization of the ground that Kirby does with black. I mean, again, it's stylized design that also functions within the stylized realism that Kirby sets up. But one of the real surprises of Mr. Miracle was not Oberon, his buddy down below, but yeah, that would be Big Barda. This is Kirby giving us a classic Kirby Amazonian type Wonder Woman, even though it's not Wonder Woman, it's Big Barda. And I mean, she kicks ass. She takes names. This is at the dawn of the women's lib movement. But Kirby said he based her on the entertainer Lainey Kazan, who was, as you can see, a rather what you would call, I don't know what you call, without being sexist, there must be a term for her type of figure. She was a tall and rather pulchritude is the word I'm looking for. The Robalesque. Okay, anyway, you get the idea. And in fact, that's Ava DuVernay, the writer, movie director, who was supposed to be doing a New Gods movie. I just heard it was put on indefinite hiatus, which means maybe it won't get done. But for the last couple of years, she was given the gig because her favorite comic character was Big Barda. That's who she identified with growing up. Well, to make a longer story short, Kirby's books didn't sell. And by 1973, Mr. Miracle was the last of the Fourth World books to be published. And that's issue 18, I think, in March of 74, which means it came out at the end of 73. But by then, the other Fourth World titles had been canceled for low sales. And who is him? You think it was Darkseid? No, it was Carmine Infantino, the publisher. He told me years later when I interviewed him for one of my history projects, I said, Carmine, you always said that the Fourth World books were losing money and you couldn't afford to keep them published. So I know it's $1972, but how much were they losing that you had to cancel the guy you brought in to let him do his magnum opus? And within less than 2 years, you canceled the whole thing. He told me, Arlen, they were losing $500 a month, each of the 4 books. Now, folks, again, this is $1972, but still, after I pulled my jaw off the floor, I said, Carmine, are you kidding me? You know, there were fans back then that would have paid you $500 a month per book to keep them published. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know, your guess is as good as mine, but that's what he told me. And that's why Kirby's magnum opus is what many believe, especially a slightly younger generation. If you came of age with Kirby's Fourth World books, that is your great Kirby work. If you were a little older and came of age with his Marvel works, then the Fourth World books are a little problematic because of that opera-like quality that turned a lot of fans off, my brother included. But look at this quote from years later. Gary Groth is the guy behind the Comics Journal and Fantagraphics, great publisher, great critic. And he asked Kirby, what was the most creatively rewarding period in your career? When I was given full reign on the New Gods. I was given full reign on the New Gods and Mr. Miracle and many other strips, which made me very happy. And, you know, it's a shame Infantino tried to let Kirby do his thing and was coming up with concepts and things. So during the time that the Fourth World sales were declining, we get this house ad in 1971 in the middle of Kirby's magnum opus. And look at all the different messages we're bombarded with in this house ad. This is the beginning of the Speak Out series. What? Okay. The Roaring 30s come alive in the days of the mob. The newest Kirby blockbuster. Okay. A different magazine is born, whatever that means. Authentic illustrated stories. Well, what does that mean? Unusual photo stories. Okay. Special humor of period by the famous Sergio Mad Aragonis. Okay, well, humor of period, new size, new shape, new printing, free giant authentic John Dillinger Wanted poster. Look for it on your newsstand, 50 cents. Okay, again, okay, so it's something, whatever the hell it is. Now, this was the time that the novel that would be made into the epic film was a big blockbuster. That's why they made the films. And somehow when this thing came out, this magazine size thing that shows Kirby's work at the bottom, but what is that weird illustrated image in the center that's not Kirby's work? And I mean, it's really one of the ugliest design. And to me, it's just, again, Hampshire Distributed Limited, but yet it was put out by DC. Like, the whole thing is really a mishmash. But it really speaks a lot for, again, the mixed messages we were getting with Kirby's work at DC. So we're getting Kirby doing his take on, you know, 1930s, you know, Bonnie and Clyde type stuff, but in this weird blue wash duotone. Once again, the inking by Vince Scaletta, which turned me off. And I really hate, like, if you're going to do black and white comics, do them as black and white or with gray tones. What is this weird blue tone? But again, It was just Kirby showing how he could do any genre of any time period. And, you know, you get some classic Kirby art. And then I think not too long later, we got this weird looking publication. Now, I'm a Neil Adams fan, and I'm looking at the middle left screaming figures. Is that Neil Adams? Is that his art? Yeah, that looks like Neil Adams in the center. So it's a Neil Adams art, but it's a Kirby magazine with weird background art. I mean, once again, graphic design wise, it's really a mishmash. But inside, once again, this weird blue wash tone, which, you know, maybe the subject matter being more along the lines of a horror comic, but I remember being totally turned off by this look. But with the Fourth World canceled, it was through his roots in horror comics, like his and Joe Simon's Black Magic in the 1950s, that would give rise to the next round of books he would do at DC in the wake of the Fourth World's premature decapitation, as I refer to it. So first up in the summer of 72 is The Demon, a new and exciting character spawned from the ancient cultures to battle the kind of villains that shake you up. Look out for him. He'll be at your news dealer soon. Soon. And then we got this cover in the summer of 72. Jack Kirby's startling new epic, The Origin of the Demon. Now, what is this crazy character from Kirby? Well, the roots of the character lie in one of his boyhood loves, the great Prince Valiant Sunday comic strip by Hal Foster. Started in the 1930s. I think he did it till the early 70s, then passed it on to others. But it's considered the greatest realistic comic strip of all time. And if you notice, there's no word balloons. They were just illustrations with accompanying text and captions, you name it. But in one particular sequence in the 1930s, you get the prince having to make a disguise so that he can sneak in to this palace for whatever the plot of the story was. And this is what it looks like. And the horrid yellow skin is pulled over his head and padded here and there with feathers. Now you can obviously see the resemblance to Kirby's demon face. But then you look at what might have been a source of even Hal Foster's imagery from an obscure silent film, a Swedish horror film from like 1929 with some I didn't get the translation of the title, but there is our devil demon. And when you look close at him, you can see both Foster's and maybe even a little bit of Kirby's demon as well. I'm not a fan of horror. I never really got into the demon, but, you know, more of Mike Royer's faithful inking. And if you're into this kind of stuff, I think it ran for 17 issues maybe from 72 to 75. And again, you know, this is what Kirby was doing in the Demon. I mean, Kirby could do any genre. And, you know, he chose, if you wanted horror, he would give you horror. But the Demon, like all of these DC creations, would never say die after Kirby stopped doing them. Years later, the great Bruce Timm, the animator behind, excuse me, Batman, the animated series, obviously was a fan of Kirby's Demon and would work him into, every now and then he would do a comic book cover or sometimes interior story for DC Comics. So there is his take on Kirby's Demon. Now check out this meta image of Kirby's Demon being read by one of Kirby's other new characters that he would create in the wake of the Fourth World's demise. And that would be Kamandi, the last boy on Earth, being advertised. Beasts that act like men, men who act like beasts. See the world of Kamandi, a sensational DC Jack Kirby blockbuster. Now, right away, we're going to talk about the giant Statue of Liberty. Don't worry. But here's what we get. Mike Royer, again, inking Kirby faithfully. So we're obviously in a post-apocalyptic blah, blah, blah. And yes, you get the classic Statue of Liberty image again as a double-page spread. By the way, look how nicely Kirby delineates ocean using black ink and faithfully inked by Royer. Really nice water here, the way the waves bob and eddy. Yep, Rod Serling did it first, Planet of the Apes, 1968. But come on, he wasn't the first. It was a science fiction trope. This isn't the only pulp magazine from the 50s or 40s or 30s. I think this is from the, I'm not sure what year this is from. I think it's early 50s. But either way, this trope of the buried Statue of Liberty signifying that, oh, we're actually on Earth, or whatever the concept is supposed to be, is something that Kirby used like everybody else used it. But Kirby really thought out this apocalyptic world of Kamandi, and Kamandi went on to be the longest published of Kirby's DC titles after he left. So it had a fan base enough to sustain it after Kirby's departure in 75. But you can see in these map illustrations how Kirby, once again, really thinks out the worlds. And, all the great artists create worlds. And Kirby, this qualifies him, certainly, because he creates a world in Kamandi of, animals that act like men and men that act like animals, or whatever the phrase was. But you can see the giant ape or gorilla or whatever that is, right? Of course, remember Planet of the Apes, we saw it, a bunch of years earlier. But, Kirby had been doing anthropomorphized characters back in the 50s and probably in the 40s too. But, this one's taken from some anonymous comic while he was probably with Simon. And you can see that in Kamandi, again, beautiful double-page spreads, Kirby really strutting his stuff on all manner of apocalyptic post, future world. If that's your bag, man, you'll love Kamandi, because you can see Kirby's brutalist architecture on display, as only Kirby can do it, with, all that energy, all that dynamism. He even got to do an oddball story about the legend of Superman kind of living on into Kamandi's future. And like all of Kirby's concepts at DC, they're still being recycled, rebooted for new audiences. This, I believe, is one of the great modern comic artists, Ryan Sook, S-O-O-K. He does great stuff if you want to seek him out. But this just goes to show you how Kirby's works, even if they weren't commercially successful, affected a generation of young comic readers who would go on to say, yeah, DC, I'll do Kamandi. I love Kamandi growing up. Anyway, I think October of 75 or 74, Kirby gives us this oddball concept, OMAC, one-man army, A startling look into the world that's coming. And this is where, according to this early sketch of Kirby's explaining the concept dated 1973, OMAC is Buddy Blank, and look at Brother I, obviously combination of Orwell's term. But you can see, without having to read every bit of Kirby's writing, that OMAC is obviously Kirby's new take, and I love the pre-punk mohawk, on the super soldier concept, one-man army corps. And that's what the short-lived, again, maybe it lasted 15 issues, something like that, or maybe less, 11 issues. But there is, great double-page spread with classic Kirby tech. And, if this is your style of story, check out OMAC. Years later, in the early 80s, he would recycle some of these OMAC ideas and do a short-lived series for an independent comic company, Pacific Comics, at the dawn of the 80s, called Silver Star. So you can see that Kirby is, again, like any great artist, Bob Dylan, Picasso, Bruce Springsteen, Martin Scorsese, Spielberg, you name them, David Lynch. They recycle great ideas. They keep refining them and redoing them and bringing new life to them. But OMAC, like his other titles of the period, features some really beautiful double-page spreads, as well as some classic Kirby. You talk about brutalist. I mean, in your face, stuff like this. I mean, look at the stylized talons or horns, whatever the white things are, coming out from that beast. Like I said, we could spend a lot of time on this image, but, that's Kirby, man. Late Kirby, brutalist, double-page spread. But then he gives us, in winter 74, early 75 maybe, his most successful in terms of sales series, The Sandman. Now, you can see that it's being done by Simon and Kirby. So they team up again. Script by Joe Simon, but there it is. And sales of this were through the roof. A couple issues later, the great Wally Wood would ink an issue or two. And The Sandman, of course, was a recycled Kirby concept that he did at DC Comics in the 40s. That's what he looked like with his sidekick. I don't know, Sandy or something. And then there was this character he came up with called Manhunter. And that was in DC's Adventure Comics. And in 1974, 75, he gives us a one-shot where he recycles Manhunter. Nothing to write home about, folks. And then one of the last titles he did at DC was a war title, The Losers, which were characters he inherited from the writer Bob Kanigher and probably the artist Joe Kubert. They did all the foundational DC war titles. But it was in these issues that, if you're a fan of war comics, Kirby really got to inject a lot of his actual World War II experiences. If you remember from part one, he fought in Patton's army. And he actually witnessed stuff like this that he would later draw. And this is what he wrote. This is a war which has jumped all previous boundaries. Civilians are killed, not by accident, but by design. They look wrong. They think wrong. They talk in ways intolerable to those with the gun. And when the gun begins to bark, it cannot see men, women, and children. Its sights are centered on labels, thousands of dying labels. Now, this image, to me, is reminiscent of this image, which is by the great artist Goya, called The 3rd of May, 1808. And the great art historian Kenneth Clark said this was the first great picture which can be called revolutionary in every sense of the word, in style, in subject, and in intention. And I think Kirby's Massacre, I love the dialogue of two of them about to be murdered. Stand fast, don't give them the satisfaction of showing fear. Beasts, beasts. It was around this time in 1975, this picture was taken. One of the only times that Jack Kirby actually met the great Marvel Comics artist and inker par excellence, Joe Sinnott, who inked years of Kirby's best Fantastic Four works from 1965 to 1970. That is really unparalleled in the history of comic book art. And it was that year that Kirby made the decision that his time at DC was up and that he had to go back to Marvel Comics. And sure enough, the fan magazine Marvel was putting out at the time, FOOM, Friends of Old Marvel, would promote it this way. But his tenure that we call Marvel 2.0, it starts off the same way the DC tenure started. While he agreed to write, draw, and edit his own works, he agreed to return to Captain America, who was now teamed up with the African-American superhero, the Falcon. But notice the pencil to the first issue was inked by Marvel mainstay John Romita, and look at what they do to Kirby's face. That is a total John Romita face with a Kirby body. So right away when we saw this, dated January 1976, but it came out obviously in the fall of 75, I remember going, what the actual F? Why isn't that a Kirby face on his own character? Anyway, Mad Bomb would initiate a couple-year run of Captain America stories that I gave a shot, but again, I had trouble reading Kirby's writing. I always thought his dialogue was awkward and stilted, and even his art was beginning to lose something. If you look at this, I mean, that image of Captain America, just, yeah, it's the same square fingers and blocky knees, but, oh, you're looking at Kissinger. Yeah, I forgot Kissinger. Well, speaking of Kissinger and the government, 1976 was the bicentennial. And what a perfect time. It probably influenced why Kirby came back to Captain America just in time for the bicentennial. This happens to be the back cover of a tabloid-sized giant comic. I'm talking about, 11 by 17 or something like that. And here's the front cover. Captain America's Bicentennial Battles. So we expected this to be Kirby. Look, it even says bottom, middle right, Jack Kirby, King Size Spectacular. And right away, I remember my jaw dropped when I saw the splash page. Why? Because I immediately recognized it was always a game of who was inking Kirby. Kirby had some great inkers, he had some lousy inkers. But notice the credits down below. Remember, this is an extra large, like 80-page story or something. Inked by Herb Trimpe, John Romita, and B. Smith. Who is B. Smith? Well, that would be the legendary Barry Smith, an Englishman who came over to Marvel in 1968 and immediately started drawing in this kind of Kirby on steroids, or maybe Kirby on acid, circa 1968. That's how Barry Smith made his debut. But in about 5 years, we would get what became the mature Barry Smith style on the character Conan the Barbarian. And this would be the beginning of his extremely detailed, filigreed inking style. I mean, every blade of grass, every drop of sweat, every rivulet of blood on that sword, every pebble underneath the water. And yet that's what made Barry Smith a legend. And the idea that he had inked, not the whole book, but like the first 12 pages of his tabloid-sized Captain America. I don't know about you folks, but I think pages like this rank among some of Jack Kirby's greatest work. Why? Because of Barry Smith's inks. When you look at them in their black and white state, you can see the time and the care that he had honed while working on Conan just a couple of years prior, and the meticulous attention to detail he would exhibit in this handful, 2 handfuls of Captain America pages. Obviously, there are people I'm reading on internet chat boards that don't think this work is great, but are you kidding me? I'll take it 24/7, 365. I wish I had a better resolution image. It's the best I could show you, but you gotta love it. All that subtle cross-hatching that Smith throws in. It's stuff that Kirby hadn't gotten since the days of maybe Wally Wood, inking him in the late 50s. I mean, look at that Captain America pose in the bottom left panel. You gotta just love it. Yeah, I'm showing you every one of the 12 pages. I hope you're enjoying the tour. But these are unique, pal. Never to be duplicated again. Look at that classic Kirby crackle bottom right panel. Again, the top left pose, classic Kirby. And then we get the beautiful sign off of the face in the middle left panel. One of the most beautiful Kirby Captain America heads ever drawn. There it is, folks. And then you turn the page and you get this incredible double page spread. And that is a pretty wild image, because when I look at it, and it looks like, you know, a history of American war, you know, in Gettysburg, there's an indoor installation called the Cyclorama, and it was created in 1883, that painting, I mean, not the installation, but that's a 22-foot by 10-foot high painting by a French artist named Paul Philippetou. And it's titled The Battle of Gettysburg. And it's about Pickett's charge on July 3rd of 1863. And I think of that image when I think of this, especially in its penciled form. You can see Kirby's beautiful graphic design of black spaces within figures. An artist friend of mine, Adrian Moraes, looked at this image and said, Arlen, it reminds me of Picasso's Guernica. And I think it was so apt, because if you read Kirby's description to the Captain America panel, it could have well as been written for Guernica. A writhing mass of clashing phantoms swarm across a battlefield yet unseen. It's an astounding tableau because it leaves little doubt that these are the shadows of real men engaged in the deadliest game of all. And at the same time, you know, I did one of my verbal visual essays, remains unpublished, but there's a double-page spread where I compare in the center the Kirby Pietà to Michelangelo's, but I compare the Picasso to Kirby's Cyclorama and Goya's 3rd of May to his Losers double-page spread Massacre. And again, I switch captions so that Kirby's caption describes Picasso's. And Picasso, while working on Guernica, said, "My whole life as an artist has been nothing more than a continuous struggle against reaction and the death of art." And then again, Kirby's caption to, you know, that I read before could have been written about Goya's. And then listen to what Kirby said. "The secret of my success is the fact that I gave to it all I had. There is blood and bone and sinew behind the whole thing. There are hours of thinking and hours of doing. And then I spared nothing. I gave it everything." Well, his time at DC was done, so he had to come up with concepts for Marvel. So in addition to Captain America and all that bicentennial work, he also worked on his own character, the Black Panther. Again, I don't think Stan Lee had any role in its creation. If you've seen my Black Panther webinar, which I'm sure I'll do again, maybe later this year, I show how it's a total Kirby creation. And again, you know, I never really got into it because Kirby's stuff was just too, everything was on what I call Spinal Tap 11. I just couldn't get into it. But a lot of people did, and your mileage may vary. But again, some spectacular double-page spreads. And really, you know, it is Kirby's character, and you gotta love when he gets to draw the Black Panther the way he wants to draw him. And again, some cool double-page spreads. And check out this sketch that Kirby did, 1982, so years later. But you know what? While Kirby was at Marvel 2.0 in the late 70s, he turned out a couple of cool covers, like this one on the red and yellow armored Iron Man. Whenever Kirby drew this version of Iron Man, it was always cool. And then there's this cover of a major project he does in Marvel 2.0, but it's not his cover. It's an actual 1978 graphic novel, even if it's not marketed that way. And that is not Jack Kirby's art. It's the magazine cover painter, Earl Norham, who has a legion of fans. I am not among them. Years later, of course, we would see the cover that Kirby intended for this new trade paperback size giant comic book, aka graphic novel, teaming him back for the first time with Stan Lee writing, once again, the dialogue and narration. But this is at the dawn of the graphic novel. And booksellers, like the publisher, thought a comic book look would turn off potential readers. They wanted to give it what they perceived as a modern 1978 painted magazine cover look. So they hired Norham. And I don't know who did that horrible lettering, but I mean, are you kidding me? In the words of comic book men, worst comic book cover ever. Of course, you'd open it up and you'd be jolted by the familiar Kirby work. And in addition to Stan Lee rejoining him, they were able to get Joe Sinnott, his soulmate inker, to do the inking. And once again, while it's a readable work with some cool looking artwork, for whatever reason, it just failed to excite, I guess is the best way I can describe it, even though Kirby gave us some of his usual cosmic concepts. So Kirby's at a crossroads in the late 70s, even though this picture, based on all that early 70s beige and brown, is probably not from the late 70s, but he just decides he's going to throw everything at the wall at Marvel 2.0 and hope something sticks. So we got Devil Dinosaur. Once again, Kirby can draw anything, any genre. You want animals, you got animals. But then you get the brutalism of those concepts, the outrageous psychedelia, gone hyper horror, whatever you want to call this image. But I mean, that is pure Jack Kirby, what I would call late period Kirby, but man, it's just so stylized. Look at the inside of the mouth of the beast. Yeah, beautiful, huh? Maybe the best thing Kirby does in Marvel 2.0 is the Eternals. And once again, be here when gods walk the earth. So every one of us who had been mourning the death of the new gods for a couple of years had their ears perked up when we saw this house ad in Marvel Comics in the middle of 1975, maybe. And you can see that the Eternals were Kirby's next version of the new gods a couple of years later, because look how familiar looking this double page spread is from the previous one I showed you of New Genesis, done about 5 years earlier. But what the Eternals was more about was Kirby's take on, in a sense, the ancient astronauts that we know and love today. Keep in mind, this is Kirby doing a somewhat derivative work years later after the 1968 Eric von Däniken novel put him on the map and gave birth to what is now a subculture called ancient alien theory, that what old myths call, gods coming to Earth are really ancient aliens visiting Earth, sometimes in their giant spaceships, which you can see in this incredible double page spread. Kirby is showing us all of his Aztecian, Mayan, South American world culture symbology, graphic language that in the end is pure Kirby. But look at the influence it had on Geiger, who did the set design, production design for Ridley Scott's famous 1979 film Alien, which came out 3 years after Kirby does this image. In Eternals, we were feasted to double page spreads of Kirby tech that seemed to levitate off the page. And a year later, we would get this in the movies, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, with its giant mothership, which could have been one of the props of the Celestials, as they were called in Kirby's Eternals. Character designs that only Jack Kirby could have come up with his distinctive graphic signatures. And even though these only lasted just a handful of years, like all of Kirby's 1970s works, they nevertheless maintained a cult audience which grew into the fact that nowadays major creators like the great Neil Gaiman agreed to kind of return the Eternals, which Marvel owns again, even though the Kirby creations, he did them as work for hire. So Marvel can do whatever they want with them, and majorly because they knew that DC was planning a New Gods movie. So I think we're still going to be getting the Eternals in a year or two with a star-studded cast. And even in the recent Guardians of the Galaxy, they kind of teased us with this Easter egg image of what can only be described as one of Kirby's Celestials. But there's Kirby, again, at the end of the 70s. All of his prior creations of the decade had all failed, been canceled, didn't sell. And everything he did after the Fourth World is somewhat derivative. Like the next project he decides to do out of the blue is a graphic version of the television show The Prisoner, which had aired in America in 1968. So a decade later, Kirby decides that he's going to do a, graphic novel, even though the word wasn't being used back then, of The Prisoner. And you can see that it features some of Kirby's great artwork, some beautiful double-page spreads. But I just couldn't help but feel when I was aware of this, I think we only became aware of it. It never happened. Kirby never finished it. Gil Kane did a bunch of pages. It's recently been reprinted. You can track it down. But what this really shows, again, is Kirby's sense of place and location that he got out of growing up in the Lower East Side. How a guy from this background could end up doing street scenes decades later that looked like otherworldly cultures mixed in with his own worldview. And these are designs for a project that Kirby would undertake in the late 70s called Lord of Light. Lord of Light were adaptations of a famous science fiction novel by Roger Zelazny. And Kirby was working with, there's a whole backstory to this. Suffice it to say that these designs actually made it into the mainstream media because these were supposed to be designs for a science fiction theme park based on Zelazny's Lord of Light. And here's one of Kirby's designs. It's like the World's Fair. I mean, it's the Kirby World's Fair, but it's all expositions and halls and architecture, all based on concepts that Kirby adapted from Zelazny's Lord of Light. Now look at this double-page spread that he did for Thor back in 1967. And you can see that Kirby always had this architectural sense of magnitude, of building worlds. I mean, look at this, the royal chambers of Brahma. Again, it's world cultures, the Lord of Light. It's a little bit of everything. And only an artist of Kirby's, again, he's an autodidact. He's a polymath, self-taught from the streets, didn't go to college, and yet is able to put the world into his art. Now, this project never went anywhere, and then they decided, I forget, Kirby met other people, but they decided to take these concepts and turn it into a movie instead of a science fiction theme park. And that became a proposal called Argo. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, these were the motion picture concepts that in real life, the CIA knew the producer who had worked with Kirby on those images. And when they, sorry, I forgot to mute everybody. Can everybody please be quiet? But Argo was based on the real life story of how the CIA used Kirby's drawings to convince the Iranians that they really were going to make a movie shot in Iran, and they needed to scout locations and move around. And that's how they were able to smuggle the hostages out. And yet, when it came time to making the movie, for whatever legal reasons, maybe it was about money, but they didn't actually use Kirby's work in any of the movie. There's prop artwork behind Alan Arkin and John Goodman on the wall there. That ain't Kirby's. Around the same time, Kirby decides to do a Sunday comic strip version of Disney's The Black Hole, which was their failed post-Star Wars science fiction movie of late 70s, early 80s. And here's a couple of examples of Kirby's art. The kind of phoned in Kirby, pretty much standard stuff, nothing really new. And again, Kirby maybe just taking the paycheck, and you can't blame him after having not really made any real money in comics based on how much money his creations. There's the best resolution. As far as I know, these have never been collected, but you can probably track them down. Who knows? And then Kirby's last film project of the era would be, yes, doing his tabloid-sized graphic adaptation of Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. There's the wraparound cover. Now, folks, before we get into the project itself, I think 2001 is the greatest color film ever made, with Citizen Kane being the greatest black and white. They are the two movies that define all the filmmaking language we have today. 2001 is a masterpiece. And when I saw this, I was like, why is Kirby adapting a masterpiece of film? Even though it's Jack Kirby, I get it, but inside, yeah, we got Kirby giant double-page spread versions of Kubrick's concepts. Douglas Trumbull special effects. I mean, okay, do we really need to see Kirby do a drawing of a monumental scene in the film? And then, of course, the film's most spectacular sequence, the monolith Stargate at the end of the film, the last 20 minutes. And Kirby does his graphic version of it. Now, on the one hand, I can admire this as a pure abstract work of comic art. But on the other hand, I can't help but feel, why, Jack? Why not instead give us something new? Whenever a young artist would come up to Kirby at a convention and show them their work, which was often imitating Kirby's work, he would say, kid, draw in your own way, come up with your own things. And even though these are wild examples of Kirby's, again, most psychedelic, most expressive even, abstract artwork in his whole career, maybe, I can't help but feel there's something a little anticlimactic to it because of the greatness of Kubrick's film. Anyway, after the tabloid came out, it was announced that Kirby was going to do a regular series at Marvel 2.0. And it would begin an anthology series of books done in one each month about a different character encountering the mysteries, really, of the universe. But over time, while Kirby's doing Marvel 2.0, the title gestates into more of a kind of, quote, superhero title. As you can see, we begin a new journey to the stars and beyond, an origin to top all others, the capture of X-51. Well, before long, 2001 would be discontinued, and X-51 would be spun off into his own title one of Kirby's last at Marvel 2.0, Machine Man, the living robot. And this is maybe the prime example of that work, which is just another in a long line of a theme of Kirby's graphic exploration, the mixture of human and technology, which is really the bedrock of his lifelong work. He would put out images like this in the 70s, just one-shot illustrations of his concepts merging the human with the artificial. Now, he had been doing this really ever since Galactus in the 60s, this being one of the great full-page images, inked, believe it or not, by Vince Scaletta, who did every now and then, just like a clock is right, a broken clock is right twice a day. Coletta every now and then would ink. But, I bet you the type pencil of this, your grandmother could probably ink it and look just as good. But I digress. The point is, Kirby was always experimenting graphically with this mixture of human and technology. Look how influential this portfolio image, circa 1970, has been decades later, when you can find this incredible cosplay on the internet. Kirby, at the dawn of the 70s, would put out portfolios of these images that he had really begun while at Marvel doing Thor. And you could find now in a beautiful revised edition through the Tomorrow's publishing group that does the Jack Kirby Collector. But you can see that Kirby was always dealing with gods, old gods and new gods. Some of these ended up becoming characters he would use in his 70s and 80s stories. Some would remain curious portfolio curios like this. I love, once again, the brutalism of this image, the cover of a portfolio of similar Asgardian-like godmen. But this portfolio was different. This is called Jacob wrestling with the angel, based on the biblical story. Jacob is another name for Israel, and Israel means to struggle with God. When Jacob wrestled with God, he was given the name Israel. And we all struggle with God. We're all the nation of Israel. But look at Kirby's mixture of high tech with brutalism, his Michelangelo meets Picasso human anatomy, and then his mechanized angel, as only Kirby could design him. This image is of God. It's got the classic giant Kirby knee and the Old Testament bearded old white man. But some real beautiful stylized imagery by Kirby. And here's God looking on what can only be described as a pretty depressing view of maybe the planet Earth in Kirby's eyes. A planet of degradation, of horror, of war, of pain, of every negative. And God just looking on, almost like, I can't believe I created this POS. And this image, really, it's God turning his back on man. If that's how we're to interpret the beings on the planet below, railing against God, both praying to him, as you can see one figure, supplicating themselves, but also cursing him. A far cry from Michelangelo's classic image of God and man. And yes, Jack Kirby, the greatest comic book artist, the Michelangelo of comics. Recently, only in this century, is he finally getting his due as not just the great comic book artist, but the great artist. Starting in the early 21st century, there would be major museum exhibitions that would use Kirby's work as their main promotional image. Look at how the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles took this black and white art inked by Sid Shores, controversial inker of Kirby in the late 60s on Captain America. I vote thumbs down, but nevertheless, it was part of this epic cover that is one of Kirby's great Captain America images at Marvel Comics. And then remember this great image? Well, that became the keynote image of one of the greatest American exhibitions of Jack Kirby's work ever by a professor of comics at University of California oh man, I just blanked on the name of, it's not Pasadena, it's, I just blanked on it. But Charles Hatfield is a Kirby scholar, and he put together what really is the way a comic book art exhibition needs to be done, not just framing the original art, but by blowing up pieces larger than life to really get across art in a museum setting. I said greatest American exhibition. This was a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago. But I think this was only 2 years ago over in, I think, France. Yes, Cherbourg, France, sorry. You get this exhibition, which really makes use of the Fourth World art in its promotion and its look. But once again, very sophisticated museum design. It just goes to show you how great comics can look when they're designed into a space with a little bit of panache and a little bit of drama. But Kirby's not only in museums these days, he's on the stage. I saw a great play based on Kirby's life in Brooklyn a couple of years ago by Crystal Skillman and Fred Van Lente. And it was brilliant. And I think it's now a podcast. It's a series of, they did a radio version of it. So look for that. King Kirby, Crystal Skillman, Skillman, and Fred Van Lente. And you should find it. Kirby's been the subject of scholarly books and biographies. I mentioned Mark Evanier earlier. Recently, Tom Scioli, if I'm pronouncing his name right, did a really, an epic graphic novel biography of Kirby that's really mind-blowing in its own way. You got to see it to believe it. So check that out. Don't let the manga eyes dissuade you. It's really a brilliant work of art in its own right. Of course, reprints of Kirby's work have been readily available in all different formats. Marvel's put out his work, you know, Captain America, The Thing, of course, part of the Fantastic Four. IDW puts out these things called artist editions that are giant size. I mean, you know, what do you call it? 24 by 18 inches, maybe I'm getting the size wrong, but humongous facsimile reproductions of the original art. Beautifully designed. I mean, these are the end papers. Marvel's been doing, I got to say, a pretty good job at preserving Kirby's work. I mean, this is another giant sized, but in full color, reprinting of some of his key Thor works. And look, they just came out with a giant sized volume of his very controversial 1970s Marvel 2.0 works that we just looked at. And DC's been doing a yeoman's job reprinting the Fourth World in multiple formats. This very graphic design, recent slipcase volume is designed by one of the great comic book graphic designers, Ryan Hughes. But you can see that there have been multiple hardcover editions of Kirby's Fourth World work. And it's that Fourth World New Gods work that's proven to be, though it was not a sales success according to Carmine Infantino, ended up affecting an entire generation of artists who have gone on to put Kirby's concepts into their works. This is Bruce Timm putting Orion and the rest of the New Gods into his late 1990s animated series, The Justice League. And there's High Father in the foreground and Light Ray in the background. You can see that Orion is constantly being used in new comic book projects decades later. Here is the great Walt Simonson doing a series that ran for a couple of years, his take on Orion. And of course, Walt Simonson did the greatest version of Thor since Kirby's in the early 80s that rocketed him to fame. One of Simonson's contemporaries who passed away about 10 years ago at the early age of 57 was Marshall Rogers. And this is from the late 70s, 1979 maybe, where it's the first time somebody did a reboot of Mr. Miracle after it had been published for about 6 years. And it seems like every decade, somebody at DC does their take on Mr. Miracle. These are versions from successive decades up to and including the last decade, which really was a brilliant deconstruction of Mr. Miracle and the superhero genre in general. I know deconstruction is a very she word to use these days, but I can't think of any other way to describe it when it's done well. And that's why Ava DuVernay tapped the writer Tom King to collaborate with her on the script for what was supposed to be an upcoming Warner Brothers mega blockbuster film based on Kirby's New Gods characters, which you can see in these internet photos that I find of how Kirby's characters, which didn't succeed commercially, have a life of their own decades later, and show you the power of Kirby's impact on a generation of artists like the great Steve Rude, who did this illustration a couple of years ago on all of Kirby's New Gods and Fourth World concepts. And if you combine that longevity with images like this from around the world, I believe this might be in Italy, of a public mural, a knockoff of Kirby's work. I don't know who the artist is. It might be the guy in the photograph, but you can see it focuses on his Marvel works. When you combine that, you get the universe that is Jack Kirby's art. And you know what? I can't think of any better way to end this presentation by something I saw today on the internet. And that is this image, the most detailed, highest tech close-up of a human cell using all the latest cutting edge micro photography and technology. And here's what Kirby once said. I used to read the first science fiction books, and I began to learn about the universe myself and take it seriously. I know the names of the stars. I know how near or far the heavenly bodies are from our own planet. I know our own place in the universe. I can feel the vastness of it inside myself. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending the one and only king of comics, Jack Kirby. Folks, if you go to my webpage, arlenschumer.com, you'll get to this homepage, which has a couple of short videos that introduce me. You scroll down, you can click on my still in print Silver Age book that is really the only book of its kind, because I have every history book, but only my book really treats the art of comics as art. And I take out the original word balloons and I put the artist talking about the art. So in that Galactus panel in the lower left, that's Kirby telling you how he tried to get God into a comic book character, and he came up with Galactus. My comic book history part of my website has my whole history and various comics history projects, many of which are about Kirby's work. This is a 16-page verbal visual essay I did as a standalone printed piece about 10 years ago to support the Jack Kirby Online Museum. And I based it on the auteur theory of film, in which I write and design how Kirby should be considered the same way the French film critics in the 50s began to claim that our commercial directors, like the John Fords and the Howard Hawks and Alfred Hitchcock, are really the authors of their movies, not the screenwriter. They're the auteurs. And that's the point I try to make with the way Kirby worked with Stan Lee, is that he was the auteur of every Kirby story that had Stan Lee's name on it as the writer of it. And if you notice in the center, there's Francois Truffaut at the top, one of the French film critics who became a great director in his own right, and how, as you scroll down, he morphs into Kirby. And on the right, you've got one of the Silver Surfer pages from Fantastic Four showing you all of Kirby's margin notes for Stan Lee to follow, to know what to put in the word balloons in the caption boxes. According to Stan Lee, he said it was like filling in a crossword puzzle. Well, the only problem was the stories were credited to written by Stan Lee and drawn by Jack Kirby. Unlike the Beatles, who I try to make a visual analogy with, Lennon and McCartney split everything they wrote 50-50, but not so with Kirby Lee. Lee would go on to claim, both in the court of public opinion and in court testimony, that he created all the Marvel Foundation characters and stories single-handedly, and then had his great artists like Jack Kirby just draw them up. Well, I deal with a lot of layers in my design work, especially because images that I'm showing you have layers of meaning. For example, Martin Goodman, the publisher of Marvel, didn't like the original name of Kirby's foursome with Lee. He was called the Fabulous Four. He thought it was too fey. So he had Lee change it at the 11th hour to Fantastic Four. If Martin Goodman had stuck his neck in, they would have been the first Fab Four, not the Beatles 3 years later. But I've done live lectures on Kirby's work for a Kirby Museum pop-up in the Lower East Side, where Kirby was raised as Yaakov Kurtzberg. You can see how I tried to draw a parallel between Kirby tech and growing up on the Lower East Side. In 2015, the 70th anniversary, I think, or 75th of Captain America, I did another live lecture at the Kirby Pop-Up Museum called Cap and Jack, my little nod to my favorite Billy Joel song. Most recently, last July, I did a webinar on Kirby's and Steranko's, the two great Captain Americas of the 1960s. The same decade Kirby created the Black Panther. And I did a verbal visual essay of that, as well as a live lecture. And I did it as a webinar last year too. 2017, on the centennial, I lectured at the prestigious 92nd Street Y in Manhattan. And that was the year I had designed this image for my Facebook group that you can come join if you friend me on Facebook, Jack Kirby and Company with a K. I also have a Facebook group on Neil Adams' work. He was my biggest influence, and of course, one on the Silver Age itself. Adams was my biggest influence on my illustration, doing comic book art for advertising magazines. And one of my specialties is turning real people into superheroes. And a lot of times I'm basing them on Kirby's concepts, like the Fantastic Four. For Entertainment Weekly, I had to turn the Seinfeld group into the Fantastic Four. When they told me they wanted me to turn the Seinfeld group into superheroes, I thought it was going to be Superman and Lois as Elaine, because you know how much Jerry loves Superman on the show. But no, they wanted the Fantastic Four. So it had to break down, I think, the way I did it. I've always tried to do Captain America knockoffs wherever I could. So who best to represent the television network ABC with its circular logo than my knockoff of Captain America as ABC Man, and the Fox, the NBC Peacock, and the CBS Doctor Strange-like eye. This was for Print Magazine, the graphic design trade magazine. At the turn of the century, they were putting together a humor issue, and they gave me 4 pages. So I came up with a 4-page story on the fight between Art Man, representing hand-drawn art, and CompuTerror, copyright Arlen Schumer. And yeah, you can get a T-shirt and every kind of poster and knick-knack and tchotchke known to man since I recently hooked up with the internet merchandise site tpublic.com, and over 100 of my images are there in, like I said, every kind of permutation you can find. I also have my own merchandise site with a lot of images that are not on TeePublic for copyright reasons and such, so you can go there. My visual lectures page, which is what I used to call what I used to do live pre-pandemic. My YouTube channel linked from my visual lectures page. You can see a lot of videos of my recent webinars and my older live lectures. One of those, ever since the pandemic, I've teamed up with New York Adventure Club, and you can go to their site, nyadventureclub.com, because I believe next Wednesday, the 14th, at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time at night, I will be doing images I hinted at tonight on the relationship between fine art and comic book art. And go to nyadventureclub.com for that. Then a week later, I'm back on my own with my free Zoom webinar series on the first 4 Connery Bond films. Last month, I did Dr. No, and I believe it'll be Wednesday, the 21st of April at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. From Russia with Love, the most Hitchcockian of Bond films. And then the last Wednesday of this month, I'm back with my Great Artists of the Silver Age webinar series, and I've decided it will be, of my August group pictured here, the great DC Comics artist, the legendary Joe Kubert, the savage style of Joe Kubert. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to an official end